We have Allison Nimlos in the house today with us to talk about the very important topic of diabetes burnout and some ways to cope and manage. And so with that, Allison, I will give it to you to introduce yourself and start the presentation from there.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. So I'm actually just going to get started with sharing the slides first. There we go, and then I hit play. And I think everything disappears from there, so I can't really see anything once I do that, but hopefully
you're good to go.
It's showing for you guys. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for watching, whether you're watching live while we're recording or if you're watching later on YouTube, or if you're watching for the first time as we're streaming this on Facebook. It's very exciting for us. This presentation is on diabetes, distress, and burnout, what it is, why it happens, and what you can do about it. I am a licensed associate marriage and family therapist. I come to you not just online remotely, but also from an entirely different state. I currently live in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I'm so bummed that I was not able to come to Omaha this spring to meet all of you in person. No one was, because obviously with everything going on with our country with COVID-19, we had to cancel. So super bummed that I was not able to add Nebraska to my list of states that I've visited. I was really looking forward to it. So hopefully I will have a chance to come back in the future to meet you all and to see Omaha. I've had type 1 diabetes for 26 years. And I currently manage it with an Omnipod and Dexcom G6. And I like to think of myself as a bit of a burnout expert. It's one of the things that I'm most passionate in helping people with and educating about, because we can spend a lot of time talking about the ins and outs of how to manage diabetes with blood sugar and technology and different medications that are available, but our mental health can often get overlooked. And as a therapist, it's one of the things that I'm most passionate about. And of course, as somebody who's had diabetes for 2.5 decades, I've definitely experienced burnout myself on more than one occasion. So I bring both professional lens through my experience working with clients with diabetes who are going through burnout, as well as my personal experience and insights. So one of the very first things I always like to talk about is sort of this distinction or clarification about what are diabetes, distress, and burnout, because those words can be used somewhat interchangeably in a lot of the literature that I've read, depending on what website you're on or who you're talking to. You may hear somebody saying diabetes distress, but another person might say diabetes burnout. And so are they the same? Are they different? They're generally speaking the same. Distress and burnout are typically just used interchangeably to mean about the same thing. There's a wide spectrum of how distress and burnout can show up for an individual. There can be low levels of distress and burnout. There can be high levels of distress and burnout. So even when we use the words, I'm feeling distressed, I'm feeling burned out, those also have, there's a great spectrum of what that can look like. Generally speaking, how it's defined is the worries, concerns, and fears among individuals with diabetes as they struggle to manage their disease over time. There's not a defined set of symptoms or criteria for being in distress or being burned out. And I think that's a really important, for me, distinction, because I have talked to a number of people over the years who will tell me, well, I don't really think I'm burned out, because my A1C is still whatever it is, 6s, 7s. So, I'm not really burned out because I'm still taking care of myself. Or they don't think that they're distressed or burned out because, they have mostly good days and only some days where they're bummed out or they're frustrated. So they say like, I'm not really in distress. And I don't necessarily think that is helpful, because as a therapist, being aware and naming what we're experiencing, regardless of how it compares to someone else, is really important. You know, your own experience of diabetes is as valid as the next person's. It typically shows up with fatigue, so both physical fatigue and mental fatigue, frustration over numbers, over all the stuff we have to carry, anger, shame, confusion, and just this general sense of fed upness with diabetes, where we sort of just say, like, I just don't really want to do this anymore. I'm tired of trying. And one of the big risks of being in distress or being in burnout, and not recognizing it and not taking care of it, is that eventually it can lead to a lapse in health behaviors. So people can stop testing their blood sugars as frequently, or they may go without wearing a CGM. If that's something that they normally do, they may stop wearing it. They may find themselves not being as careful with carb counting. They may get lax with pre-bolusing. So in the beginning, it can sometimes just be the emotions and the thoughts that we have about living with diabetes, but eventually it can snowball into how we actually manage our diabetes. And that's when it can show up in our A1C and how we physically feel. People always ask me about depression. Is diabetes distress the same as depression? How does depression factor in with this? So the depression rate is higher in people with diabetes than the general population, but it is actually lower than diabetes distress. So here are some stats, if you're a stats person like me. The rate of depression is about 7 to 10% among the general population in the US. So if you're looking at all 330 million of us, about 7 to 10% of people have major depressive disorder. They have a clinical diagnosis of depression. It's double the risk for people with type 1 or type 2 diabetes, so roughly 20 to 25%. But there is a risk of, there's a 40% population that has diabetes distress, so it's even double of the depression. So the number of people who have diabetes distress is much greater. There's a much greater chance that you'll have it or that you'll experience it at some point. And in studies, researchers also found that diabetes distress is associated with higher A1C and a percentage of missed boluses, like I talked about before, those health behavior changes, but not as much with depression. Which not that people with depression may not also experience changes, but the correlation wasn't the same. The likelihood that diabetes distress would affect your A1C is much greater than depression itself. So in the research, which most research that I'm quoting is by two psychologists and their team, William Polanski and Lawrence Fisher. Bill Polanski is out of UC San Diego, and Larry Fisher works at UCSF in San Francisco. And their main hub for their research is diabetesdistress.org, so very easy to find. And what they have found in their study is there's actually 7 types of diabetes distress. So we can actually break it down even more. And hopefully this will give you kind of a sense and some language around what you're actually experiencing and how to communicate that to your loved ones or your healthcare professionals, or even yourself, just if you're kind of confused why you might be feeling the way that you are. So these are not in any particular order. I literally put them in alphabetical order because I didn't want to have preference for one or the other. But I do think hypoglycemic distress is probably the one that I see the most often, just happens to come at the beginning of the alphabet. Low anxiety is another term that a lot of people will use, and that's really around the fear that a low blood sugar may happen and we won't be able to take care of ourselves when it does. It may show up as a fear of going to sleep and not waking up, the dead in bed syndrome that you may have heard of. That can cause a lot of anxiety for people. Or just being caught off guard with a low and being embarrassed if a low is happening in public or with people who don't understand what's going on. Family and friends distress is defined as sort of the distress that comes with just having family and friends who make comments that are rude or inappropriate or inconsiderate, or it could be family and friends who are trying a little bit too hard, that they're kind of nosy or trying to be more controlling, kind of the diabetes police that we often talk about. Food distress. So our life kind of revolves around food, right? And that can be really stressful, trying to understand how do we dose, what can we eat, feeling like we can't eat something and feeling resentful about that. Management distress can come from just all the stuff that we have to wear, stuff we have to carry, stuff that doesn't work very well. I kind of put like technology distress, just alarms and beeps and errors and sensors that don't work. So kind of management distress. Negative social perception distress, that's defined as being around stigma and a feeling that people who don't know us may misunderstand diabetes, that we'll get comments from strangers, tips about eating a cinnamon, or have you tried this smoothie from Brazil? Comments like that that can be really, really hard, over time to handle. Physician distress is around the idea of my doctor just doesn't get it. They're expecting things from me that I'm not able to do, that they don't understand how hard this is. They don't understand the kind of support that I need. I have clients who come and say, like, my doctor just says, like, I'm doing fine and I don't feel like I'm doing fine, and they're not giving me the support. Or sometimes you can even get some pretty strange questions from your doctor or from their healthcare staff about diabetes that can feel really discouraging and strange when they're, asking if you, or if you wear an insulin pump, if you brought it with you. That can be kind of distressing. And then finally, the powerlessness distress. And that is around the idea of not feeling like we'll ever be good enough, that we'll try and we'll try and we'll try and we'll never really get to the point where we're really managing diabetes and living well with it, that we're trying things and it just doesn't go anywhere. And that is really, really hard. And so when all of these things show up, all of them or one of them shows up, what can happen for our brains is we can start to really rebel. It may not even be intentional rebellion, but we can feel so discouraged and frustrated and overwhelmed with everything that we're doing and feeling like it's not working, that we start to push it away. We start to push diabetes away. We start to push the community away. We start to push our management away as a coping mechanism. It actually comes from a really sort of reasonable place that when something is causing us distress, we want to get rid of it. And for people who have a hard time articulating, or maybe don't know that this is something that they could articulate, what we end up falling back to is the management, because that's the thing that's right in front of us. And so we go into an avoidance sort of stance with our diabetes. I don't know how to handle you well enough, so I'm going to try to avoid you. Oh, where did my screen go? Hold on. Let's see. I'll try sharing again. Okay. Sorry, I don't know why it went black. So what's next? Well, first thing I always tell people when they come to me saying, I'm really struggling with my diabetes, is to understand your own unique source of distress. I listed out 7. You may have all 7, but you may only have 1 or 2 or 3. And it's really important to understand what your own specific situations, your own triggers for your distress. What's going on for you that is impacting your mental health? Because when we are able to understand the source of the distress, we're able to mitigate it with strategies. So how does it show up and where does it show up? Do you feel the most distress with lows? Do you feel the most distress when you are at family gatherings? Do you feel the most distress when you are meeting someone for the first time? Do you feel the most distress when you are trying and trying, and you get that number that you weren't expecting and didn't think was supposed to happen. So those all describe different types of distress. And so depending on where you're at, that is going to help inform what you're going to do next. So I always say you have to be honest and honor your stuff. Having a positive mindset in diabetes, or thinking positively or being empowered or being engaged, is not necessarily about pretending that everything in diabetes is just rainbows and butterflies and unicorns. Sometimes, in order to be honest with ourselves, we really have to honor what's difficult. We really have to name those things in order to manage them, because when we don't, when we stuff things down, all it wants to do is get out. It's your mindset is really wrestling with stuff. And so it's really important to recognize that pretending that diabetes isn't a big deal, if it feels like a big deal, we need to say that, we need to talk about that. So, how to manage distress and burnout. So this is one thing that a lot of people always say is, well, they want practical application. It's great to hear the definitions of what stuff is, but a lot of times people want to leave knowing, well, what are some strategies? So I have 6 for you that I'm going to share today. You don't necessarily have to put all 6 into practice. In fact, I would probably say don't put all 6 into practice right away. You might find yourself getting a little overwhelmed with lots of change. So picking 1 or 2 that feels like that'll be the best first step is what I would start with. But there are 6 that I have more, but we'll start with these 6. So the first one, actually retitled one. This used to be called Create an Empowering Mindset, but I retitled it to Discover Your Why. And these are some questions that I often ask my clients when they're really struggling with their diabetes management, when they're burned out, is to really think about, why are you managing your diabetes? One of the things that we hear from our healthcare professionals that I don't necessarily find super helpful are all the complications and all the things that could go wrong if you don't. And so oftentimes people will tell me, well, I don't want to go blind. I don't want XYZ thing to happen to me. And I'm like, okay, well, that's fair. I don't think anybody wants, those things to happen. But when we have negative ideas in our minds, it actually brings our energy down. It actually makes it harder to focus on managing diabetes, because the reason we're taking care of ourselves is to avoid terrible things from happening. And that's a hard thing to carry around for your whole life, is I'm doing all of this work so that something worse doesn't happen. And so to flip that, a reframe, a cognitive reframe, is to discover your why, to discover the positive purpose for managing your diabetes. And so these lists of questions can help you investigate that a little bit more. What keeps you focused? What are you passionate about accomplishing? What are some things that motivate you in your life? What are things that encourage you? How do you identify yourself beyond diabetes? And so finally, what is your why? And so for me, I share the story that I'm a mom. I have an almost 3-year-old son. I can't believe he's almost 3, but time's a ticking. And he's my why. When I think about why I'm managing my diabetes, I could say, well, I don't want to go blind, and to flip that, well, why? Why don't you want to do that? Well, that might seem kind of silly, right? But really dig at it. It's not a rhetorical question. Really dig at what's the benefits. And so for me, it's, well, I want to see him grow up. I love to travel. I want to see the world. And so being able to think about my son and thinking about travel, those are things that excite me. Avoiding blindness is like, yeah, I do, but that's not an exciting thing to be thinking about. That's a really depressing thing to think about. So we flip it and we start thinking about the things that get us excited and get us motivated. And that helps us to stay in it. I often say, you need to find the thing that's going to keep you in the game. Why are you in the game? What are you playing for? And I'm playing for my son. I don't know why this keeps going black. I'm so sorry. Okay, I'll just keep doing that if that's what I need to do. Adjusting your expectations. This is a big one that I think often stems from social media. And I love social media as much as the next person. I'm on Instagram. I'm not on Twitter anymore, but I was for a long time. There's blogs, there's Facebook. I mean, we're on Facebook Live right now. And one of the things that comes from being around a lot of people is we can start to see what everyone else is doing, and we can start to shift our expectations. We can even get expectations from our healthcare providers, from parents, from friends or colleagues. And one of the main ideas that I think comes from just watching lots of people managing diabetes is we start to set our expectations higher and higher and higher and higher, to the point where people start wanting to be perfect, to never make any mistakes, because we get these snapshots of really amazing blood sugars, but they're kind of isolated in time. And so I often have to remind people, what are your expectations for managing diabetes? Not that I want your diabetes management to be poor or to have lots of roller coasters, because, don't expect to be perfect, but also don't expect to be perfect, because perfect isn't a thing. We're all human, and we're all working with devices and insulins that aren't exactly what we really need. And so things will happen. And so we need to be able to adjust those expectations, especially when we're in burnout. Oftentimes when you're in burnout, it's because the expectations got so high and we're so not able to meet those high expectations that we start to feel really discouraged, and we start to feel really, critical, and not very compassionate with ourselves. So I often ask people, what are you really trying to accomplish with these goals? And are they reasonable expectations for where you're at? And often we just need to adjust the expectations and maybe move slowly back so that we don't create a burnout again. So this kind of goes back to that, the idea of being really critical when we're in burnout, and when we have high expectations, as we can start to be really, really mean to ourselves. So I always encourage people, we need to be careful with what you're saying to yourself. You're the one listening to every single thing that you say. One of my favorite questions to ask people: would you say this to someone else? If the person with diabetes, sitting next to you, or in this case, in the chat with you, was experiencing what you're experiencing and saying out loud, I'm not any good at this. I should give up. Why bother? This is, it's inevitable that something terrible is going to happen. Would you say that? Would you agree with them? Are those things that you would say back? Most of the time, the answer is absolutely not. We would never say out loud to someone else what we would say to ourselves, but for some reason we think we can get away with it, and you can't. And this really applies to almost everything. Just speaking as a therapist, self-critical thoughts are one of the biggest indicators for depression and anxiety and low self-esteem and low self-worth. So being able to examine how you're talking to yourself is really critical for your mental health. So there's some examples on the right side of your screen that I think can be kind of a helpful reframe from self-critical thoughts to self-compassionate thoughts when things kind of go awry. So, for example, what did I do wrong? Could be reframed to, what can I learn from this? Right? So it's getting at the same answer. We want to get at the same answer of learning and discovering, how can we do diabetes better? I'm a diabetic health coach, in addition to being a therapist, and helping people do diabetes better is like my number one mission in life. But to do it from a self-compassionate way of being curious rather than critical. Word choice: I'm such an idiot. I can't believe I did that. To, I'm human and I make mistakes. Shame: I shouldn't have eaten that. My whole day is ruined. Black and white thinking. I'm disappointed, right? We don't have to have the rainbows and butterflies and unicorns about diabetes. You can honor those hard emotions, but also keeping them in perspective and keeping them at a range that makes sense. I'm disappointed, but I can learn from this. I'm never going to get any better at this. So a very fixed mindset, very fixed way of looking at your own capabilities, to more of a growth mindset. I believe in my ability to learn and grow. And these are subtle shifts. So some of them, I'm disappointed, but now I can learn, is still, reflecting that things didn't go as well as I wanted. But rather than shaming and being angry with ourselves, we can recognize that emotion, but sort of then, be mindful of it, but then put it aside and focus on what can I do now? These are some other favorite word choices of mine. I'll run through them pretty quickly so that we can kind of stay on time. So first one, this one I learned many years ago and try to employ. Sometimes I even find myself still using the word test, but check is really the preferable way to approach blood sugars. Is we're not testing because there's not a pass or fail. Any blood sugar that you know is a good blood sugar, because then you can do something about it. So we say we check, we're checking in. Controlled versus managed. Controlling with diabetes, it isn't possible because there are way too many variables that impact blood sugar and our bodies than we actually physically have control over. You have control over the foods that you eat, and you have control over the amount of insulin that you give via shot or pump. You have control over the frequency of your blood sugar checks, but control over diabetes is a mindset that needs to be shifted to manage. We're managing using the things that we have control over, but we don't have full control over diabetes. Bad versus out of range. Blood sugars, again, bad is a shame-based word, judgmental word, so we choose out of range. To signify that it's more about the data point overall. Cheating versus choosing, again, that's a very loaded word, shame-based. Choosing is more of an awareness that we have choices, and we can choose to eat the piece of cake, and we can choose not to eat the piece of cake, but we're not cheating or being bad because we do that. Terrible versus hard and can't versus struggling are kind of that spectrum word. It's kind of bringing things down a few notches in our brain and kind of our perspective of the severity of something. If we're saying this is terrible or I can't do something, it is perhaps for a lot, in a lot of instances, giving more significance and really ratcheting things up a little bit more, and really activating our emotions to a point where we feel flooded with anger and frustration, which makes it difficult to stay engaged with the diabetes management. When we feel very emotionally flooded, it's hard to kind of cognitively process things. But if we can really work on slowing down and being more mindful about our word choice, it keeps us from getting a little less activated. And then my last one, my favorite one, and this is one that I mostly point out to parents, is what did you do versus tell me about, or what did you eat, versus tell me about the afternoon, tell me about your lunch, tell me about the sleepover. You can do that to yourself as well. You can kind of think of, instead of going like, oh my God, what did I do? Go, okay, let me think about what happened. And again, it's that tone of voice that can really activate the defensiveness, which can really activate the avoidance and the pushback that we want to have with our diabetes management. So to go along with parents and the support system idea is for managing burnout, for preventing burnout, we cannot do diabetes alone. Seriously, I mean, this is probably the one message that if there's one thing I want you to take away from this, is to not do diabetes alone. It's something that I have heard so often throughout my life living with diabetes, and as a family therapist, I hear from a lot of parents, a lot of caregivers, is this idea that this is their diabetes. They need to do it. They need to take over. And to a certain extent, that's true. I mean, there are certain tasks that we need to learn as we grow up. We need to be able to insert our own pump site and call the pharmacy and pick up a prescription. But to do diabetes completely alone, I don't believe in that. By helping to educate family and friends on what is helpful, what is needed, we're able to lift some of the burden off of ourselves, and we're able to just relax in a sense, to really feel like we're being, cared about in a way that is emotionally really fulfilling. We are, as Brene Brown says, we are wired for connection. And in times of stress, in times of burnout, we need those connections to lift us up. Not to mention, a lot of people want to help. A lot of parents still want to help. Spouses want to help. If you're an adult T1 with kids, your kids may even want to help out. And so helping them to learn how to help you is going to reduce some of that family and friend distress. There's not going to be as much conflict around how they're being the diabetes police and what they're saying and their attempts to bring you sugar-free whatever, or making comments of, oh, you can't eat that, so I didn't offer you any, which can be really hard, but they do want to be helpful, which I realize is sometimes hard to think about. Of course, there are always people who aren't wanting to be helpful. I'm a family therapist. I get families are all different, but to really get to know your family and see if that actually is a possibility of being able to sort of work together as a team around diabetes. Great, there's another black screen. Okay. This is my favorite slide. This isn't my favorite slide. The other one was my favorite slide, but this is probably my most controversial slide, actually. And I actually didn't make up this concept. I give full ownership to Bill Polanski. He actually came up with the idea and has talked about it a few times with me and with in other presentations that I've seen. And it's the idea of taking a diabetes vacation, which I realize seems just like a hyperbole or just like counterintuitive, that you can't take a diabetes vacation. What does that even mean? And that's true. There, to a certain extent, there is no full break from diabetes management. But there are ways that we can make adjustments to how we do diabetes that can release some of the burden and reduce some of the strain that we do feel on a day-to-day basis. And I'll talk about that. So no one can do everything, forever. Most of us need to take some kind of break. When it comes to diabetes, the first thing is it needs to be planned. Unlike burnout is usually not planned. Burnout usually just happens, and it needs to be temporary. Again, otherwise it's sort of burnout, because burnout tends to go on in perpetuity. It like just keeps rolling until something happens. And it can look like just about anything. There's no clear definition of what a diabetes vacation looks like, but I'll give you some examples. So a lot of times it's just taking a break from something in your diabetes management, or getting help with something in your diabetes management, which goes back to the earlier slide. So a lot of examples, I get this question a lot in my DMs, like probably once a week, is, do you think taking a CGM or a pump break will help with my diabetes burnout? And I always say, well, it's hard to tell because everyone's different. There are some people, if you said that, they'd say, you can pry that from my cold dead hands. That's absolutely not, that wouldn't be helpful. That would not feel like a break. But for some people it would. For some people, taking a 24-hour break from their CGM is exactly what they need. They just need to not physically wear something about their diabetes, and they're perfectly fine going back to just checking their fingers every few hours. For other people, it's taking a break from the insulin pump. Again, the thing that's burning them out is, especially if this is around like kind of management distress, technology distress, taking that off and returning to shots can give the break from the pump site irritations or the failures. That can be very distressing. So again, that's why identifying your source of distress at the beginning is so important, because it will help to inform what kind of break do you need. Some people, when they're, especially for the summer, that's another time that a lot of people want to take a device vacation, and so it feels like a break. So if we're going to the beach or the pool, probably not this summer, but for future summers, that's something that you can kind of consider doing, is to take a break and return to shot so that you're not worrying about that. Other things that I've heard people say is for special occasions, they consciously give themselves permission to not expect, kind of going back to the second slide, not expect to have absolute perfect blood sugars like during Thanksgiving or during Christmas or on Halloween or the 4th of July picnic or the Memorial Day picnic. That they sort of understand, like, this is unique. This is very once in a great while. I know that my control is not going to be quite as tight. That's another example. Again, does that work for everyone? Absolutely not. There will be other people who would say that would cause me incredible anxiety, and that would not be okay. That would not feel like a vacation. So it really depends on the individual. It depends on the type of distress that you have and your own personality. So for some things, it will work, and for other people it won't work, which is why it really can look like anything, and it's really based on you. And one of the best things you can do is just to get some support and help with that. Sometimes a diabetes vacation can just look like someone else carb counting your meal for a day or a couple days. Sometimes it is just about getting people who you trust to help you with small tasks just to ease some of that burden. So again, it can look like a lot of different things. This might not seem terribly diabetes related, but I think it is very powerful, because when I look at people who are in diabetes burnout, one of the things I often notice is that diabetes became the sole focus of life. That's all they were thinking about. It's all they were doing. Everything was wrapped up in diabetes management, and they were losing a sense of the things that they actually loved. So if it feels like diabetes is taking over and it's not letting you do what you love, if it's, causing fear, if you're avoiding things because of your diabetes management, or if it feels like I just don't have time for this anymore, it is very important to include self-care. Self-care isn't selfish. That's why I love that picture. Self-care isn't selfish. It's what we need to keep going. And maybe this isn't even related to diabetes. Maybe you are getting caught up with work and having a hard time balancing, work-life balance right now during everything that's going on in the world can feel really hard. So if you're feeling at all deprived, or if you feel like all you're doing is working, and that you're not taking care of yourself, in that emotional, spiritual, physical way, these are some. This is how you do it, is through self-care. And there's so many ideas on Google. So if you're like, I don't know if I do self-care, I don't even know what that looks like. It's not just massages. It's not just bubble baths or retail therapy, although those are all great. It can look like a lot of things. It can look like reading a book. It can look like making a home-cooked meal, baking, trying a new recipe. It can look like just a phone call with a friend. If you're not if you haven't been keeping in touch with somebody that you want to, there's lots and lots of different ways to make sure that we're focused not just on diabetes, that diabetes doesn't take over and become our entire life, even though it can feel that way, that it becomes part of what we're doing. And when we manage it well, it makes it easier to do the things that we really love. And that becomes your why. Doing things that you love can become the reason that you take care of your diabetes and can help balance that feeling of distress and burnout. So I do have some special considerations for kids and teens, for parents, and for newly diagnosed adults that I'll go through, just to make sure that this feels, as relevant and relatable as possible. So I get a lot of questions from parents about whether or not kids and teens get burnout. Absolutely. And it can look actually a little bit different for them. So a lot of burnout, especially for teens, as they're starting to take on more and more responsibility, can show up as anger or resistance to their diabetes management. They can start getting really frustrated that they're being asked to do things, even though they've been doing it for maybe years. If they're starting to have more and more responsibility of remembering to do things, they can start to become really angry with parents. And that's part of what burnout can look like for them. Teenagers, they're still developing their prefrontal cortex, which makes this stuff really hard. Prefrontal cortex is part of executive functioning, and that's not fully formed until the mid-20s. And so even though teens and kids may have been doing diabetes management for years and years, maybe since your kid was 2, they may still have a really difficult time with it because of their brain development, not because of the number of years that they've had it. You can use a lot of the things that I talked about in the presentation with kids. You can make sure that they are feeling supported in a way that is helpful. You can help them adjust their own expectations if they feel like they are expected to be perfect and to not make mistakes. That's one thing that you can help to teach them, that yeah, you're a teenager, you're human, you're gonna make mistakes, it's okay, we still love you. Validate, validate, validate. That's the number one thing that I can say for kids and teens and their emotions, is to not contradict. It's to really, really engage with them and strive to understand their perspective, even if you don't agree with it, even if you don't understand it. Validate, validate, validate. Parents, with parents in the audience, burnout doesn't happen quite the same. Very few parents I've ever come across will sort of knowingly not take care of their kids' diabetes. That just tends to not be a thing that happens. But what it usually ends up showing up as is anxiety, guilt, and grief. So those are 3 emotions that often show up, along with some of the other ones, anger and frustration and overwhelm, but it usually doesn't get to the point where they're actually pushing back against the diabetes management. They just, just sort of kind of sink under it. So number one tip is to process your own emotions. You don't have to go through this alone either, even though it can sometimes feel that way because, your mom or your dad, and it can be, well, it's not appropriate to get support from your kid, even though your kid can get support from you. It doesn't work bidirectionally because of, of the parent-child relationship. So it is probably even more critical for you to go out and find the mental health support, or to seek support from other parents in your community who really understand what it's like to be a caregiver of kiddos with type 1 diabetes. So getting plugged in with JDRF and seeing what opportunities there are. Oh, one more. Okay, but I'm almost done though, so hopefully this is the last time I have to do that. Special considerations for newly diagnosed adults. So for newly diagnosed adults, burnout and distress can happen rather quickly. The adjustment process is just so different because adults are often immediately independent. And so there is, rather than having that sort of slow handoff that teens and kids can have between parents, sort of sharing the responsibilities until the teen is sort of more on their own, adults kind of go from 0 to 60, that they've gone from not having it at all to having everything. And so that's why I really encourage that social support recommendation of making sure that if you have a partner, to get them involved. Even if you have friends or siblings or parents, to the extent that you're able to, rely on them and have them included, is to really use them as that scaffolding to help assist you with the diabetes management. It's not about them doing things for you, but it's about really having them involved to the extent that it helps ease the burden. Okay, that's the presentation, and I think we have maybe a few minutes left for any questions. So I will stop the share, and I will take any questions. If anyone has any questions, I don't know if anyone does, but if you do, or any comments, Did anyone relate to anything that I said? Anyone know what their source of diabetes distress is?
And I'm looking on Facebook right now too, just to see if anybody is putting anything in those comments, but let's see here. We do have Alfred. Can you see that?
Yes, I can. So Alfred writes, I perceive that too often some people feel sorry for themselves. Yes, you raise an important point to find a support system that includes mental aspect, not just the physical care. Caregivers need to be mindful to develop their role as a partner rather than just being a manager. That's a good, I approve and appreciate that reframe of being a partner rather than a manager. I think especially as kiddos get older, that becomes more and more as they move into college. There really is a restructuring in a lot of ways for how parents and teens and now like kind of 18, 19-year-olds, you know, how you interact with them is really becoming a partner with them in their life rather than managing or trying to control their life. So absolutely, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Let's see here. I'm just trying to look here. I don't see any other comments. Let's see. Well, I guess with that, oh, here we go. Oh, we have somebody just, thank you so much for all this.
Yeah.
Very helpful.
Oh, thank you, Rita. I'm glad that you found it helpful. I'd love to know from anyone, you know, anyone watching, was there anything that stands out that, you know, kind of your main takeaway? I know Alfred said, you know, the support system is really was an important point he found interesting. Anyone else? I always like to hear what stands out for people. Helps me know what to highlight.
It was interesting when you were talking about the, you know, if you're diagnosed as an adult and how quickly that kind of burnout could happen, just because, like you said, you go kind of from 0 to 60, and then kind of finding whether it's, you know, your parents could follow your Dexcom or, you know, other people could kind of help in that situation. So I thought that was very interesting when you pointed that out.
Thanks. Yeah, I work with many newly not necessarily newly diagnosed adults, but adults who are diagnosed as adults, and they range in how long that they've had it. And that is something that has come up, you know, several times through, you know, throughout my time working with them, just the feeling of, you know, that they are the only one managing, that no one really understands what they're going through because no one's involved. You know, when you're over 18, nobody comes with you to the diagnosis. You know, you're a grown up. No one's there in the room. And then even those who are married, you know, most people go to the doctor's appointments on their own, you know, in contrast to children who are always going with their parents. And so there is always a sense that this is a family unit, you know, mission of managing diabetes. And that sort of, it isn't encouraged from my perspective as much in adults. And I find that to be a source of burnout for people, for sure.
Thank you. Well, I guess with that, Allison, if you wouldn't mind closing out with just explaining a little bit before, like you did to me earlier, about where people can find more nuggets of information and some different things that you have coming up that I think they might find very helpful.
Absolutely. So let's see. So a few ways that people can stay connected with me. The first is on social media. Even though I talked about the frustrations of social media, I certainly use it. I am the diabetic therapist on Instagram as well as Facebook. So you can find me there. You can follow. I have my website is, I have two of them actually. One for counseling and coaching is greaterthancc.com. That is, counseling is not available to residents of Nebraska or Iowa. I'm only licensed in Minnesota, but I also do health coaching, and health coaching involves a lot of mindset work, a lot of sort of burnout mitigation strategies. And so if you feel like that would be a benefit, please check that out. I am accepting new health coaching clients. And then I also have the website, thediabetictherapist.com, where you can learn about a new project that I'm working on called In Session with the Diabetic Therapist. It's going to be a monthly webinar series, really kind of brought on by a lot of, the COVID-19 cancellations of programs, educational programs that we would normally have available to us. Coming up on May 11th is the first one with Dr. Bill Polanski, who I mentioned several times during this presentation. He's really the father of diabetes burnout. He literally wrote the book on diabetes burnout back in the 90s. So we'll be having kind of a sit-down chat, as well as having audience participation similar to this format. And I'm really, really excited that he's going to be there. And so if you go to thediabetictherapist.com, you'll be able to get the link for registration so that you can participate.
Well, thank you so much, Allison, for sharing all of this wonderful information with us. And this session is being recorded, so it will be on our chapter YouTube channel in the next few days, Nebraska-Southwest Iowa chapter YouTube. And with that, thank you everybody for joining us today. Have a great rest of the weekend. And Allison, thanks again for being with us today. We appreciate it.
Thank you for organizing and for inviting me.
Thanks.